Let's be clear about the state of affairs in Australia at the moment. There are people that are almost homeless. There are people that do not have jobs because of COVID. There are people that are suffering every single day. And that gap in the economy doesn't just hurt those people, it also hurts everyone else who is unable to profit from good infrastructure or are unable to profit from functioning transport systems. We think if we can direct those people that need that money to fulfill those economic demands, we get a better world, and that is what we do under our side. So what am I going to do in this speech? I'm going to do three things. The first thing I'm going to do is a bit of setup. Second, I'll prove why it's better for individual workers who take on these job guarantees. Lastly, I'll prove why this is better for Australia overall. Firstly, on setup. There are two things to note here on setup. The first is, what does our model actually look like in this debate? Obviously, we're doing things like job guarantees, and the wage that you will get is the minimum wage that is set. We note that anyone can take this job, and the thing that we're going to model in is, insofar as you are doing this job, we will also have a reskilling program, which is something that the government will likely do because it is electorally favourable for the government to do this stuff. Think about how favourable it was when the government reskilled people who used to work in the manufacturing industry, for instance. This is something we clearly can do under our side because of fiat. That's our model. Secondly, what are these jobs generally for? We think that these are jobs that are generally rather unpopular, which is why there's an economic gap in it. For instance, this looks like construction, and the reason why it's unpopular is because of the rise of tertiary education rates. There are fewer people that want to do things like go into construction and do manual labor. We often think that these jobs are also low skill, like no high skill requirement at all, and that's why you are allowed to pay them a rather low wage, because people who have higher qualifications can ask and demand for greater stuff. But the last thing we say is there is always a shortage of people in these jobs. And that makes sense because that's why the government would intervene in this specific instance and do things like a job guarantee. Clearly, the way in which the government works is they're trying to fulfill this gap. So the examples of the jobs that we're giving you are things like public transport. It's like the people that do the cleaning, or maybe it's your Opal officers that are checking that sort of stuff. Things like manual labor, things like construction, not things that are inherently so dangerous and harmful, and things that anyone can do, and things that are relatively, regulated by. Okay, so firstly, why do we think, oh my God, okay. Sorry. Firstly, why is it better for the individuals that choose to take these jobs? I've already demonstrated to you the sorts of individuals that take these jobs. They're likely to not be people that are particularly qualified. They're likely to be people that don't that can't get higher paying jobs elsewhere with better wages and better awards because they don't have the bargaining power with those with their employees to try and ask for those things. Why is it better for these individuals now that they get these jobs? Firstly, we say that now individuals can just get a job. Why are these jobs likely to be comparatively very good? We note that these probably won't be the best jobs, but we do think there are certain reasons to expect why these jobs, or the jobs that the government is guaranteeing, are likely to be very, very good and very, very useful for individuals. A couple of reasons. Firstly, these jobs have government awards. That looks like superannuation. That looks like no overtime, or if you do things like overtime, you get paid. We maybe have things like better insurance because the government can actually afford to do those things. Note this is particularly important because the government actually fulfills these awards way more than the alternative, which is maybe a corporation, because the people that work in the public sector, say your employee, worked in a culture or is entrenched in a culture where these awards are followed. That's why in the public sector, no one expects you to do things like work overtime and not get paid for it. You are allowed to quit at 5. And at the point where those are the people that are enforcing things like pay, or those are the people that are enforcing things like regulation, you're likely to actually get the benefits of those awards. Also note that the awards that the government gives you are far better than corporations. You get things like greater annual leave. You get things like, you get those sorts of things. And we think that that's far, far better for these individuals. Secondly, though, the reason why these jobs are likely to be comparatively better than other jobs is because there is an increased amount of scrutiny, bless you, Kat, increased amount of scrutiny on the government to ensure that these jobs are good. That's because the media can own, the media exists and its job is to scrutinize the government. But the reason why it's comparatively likely to do this well is because the media already scrutinizes the government for its policies, but it's very easy to just target one government versus targeting very many corporations and all of their different policies when those corporations have massive PR stuff to try and suppress that sort of stuff and to try and ensure that those things don't leak. We think the media is a better actor and is able to scrutinize things better under our side. But secondly, we think that we just get way better internal review systems. So for instance, the Fair Work Commission can just look at another government department's stuff or another government department's documents instead of trying to go through the bureaucracy of trying to access another corporation's stuff, which is much more difficult. Oftentimes in those instances, workers have to complain to the Fair Work Commission, and even then that's very, very difficult. Here, it is far easier to do things like internal review. That's why these jobs are likely to be good. Opposition might say, well, these people cannot consent to these jobs. We think that that these people fundamentally can. The first thing we want to note here is coercion exists under both sides of the house. Poverty exists under both sides of the house, and no one consents to be poor. No one consents to go to the corporates, like to the corporations that they probably have to stand by, and no one consents to be homeless and not have a job either. But secondly, we say that insofar as people maybe can consent, they definitely can consent under our side. The first reason why they generally can consent is because alternatives do exist and people have a level of choice. That is to say, people can rely on social services. They can rely on things like Centrelink to give them money. People can go and choose the alternative of working at a below minimum wage job. Like, for instance, Kat, who worked at a child time that paid her $6 an hour. How ridiculous, but she still chose that. But they can also work for really shitty corporations. They can also choose experimental drug trials that pharmaceutical companies do that are so much worse. We say that by the analysis I've given you already as to why these jobs are likely to be good, these things are likely to be good and people can make that decision. But thirdly, the reason why they comparatively make that decision better under our side is because there is just more information about these jobs under our side. That's because the government, unlike corporations, have the unique specific incentive to advertise their policies to the public to ensure that they're electorally favorable. So insofar as that is true, we think that that is good. The last reason why people are better under our side is because the government just has the incentive to do stuff well because of electability, but also because they want to fulfill economic demand. Compare that to corporations and the profit incentive. That is an incentive to pay you less than the minimum wage, and they can do that far better because they are not the government that has to privy to regulations. That's why, even if these jobs are not fantastic, they are definitely better than all the comparatives that Negative Team has to stand by in this debate. And that's why, and that's why that's good. What are the impacts of this? A, you have an income. B, you can support your family better. C, you can probably just live a better life. D, you probably just have more purpose to the point where you go to a job every single day. But E, you probably just get way more stability and economic predictability because you know that this job will always be there for you, which means you'll feel comfortable taking out things like loans, for instance, because you know that you can repay them. That means that you might get a mortgage under our side, or it means you might get a better car and things that are just generally better for you. And the last thing is, at the point where you're being reskilled, that is another line on your resume, another qualification you can have, and that's far, far better. That means you can bargain better under our side. Lastly then, why is this better for Australia overall? Note, contextually, COVID-19 equals a loss of jobs. Automation equals a loss of jobs. Like foreign markets decreasing their wages equals a lot of jobs. And at the point where there's structural change because of the tertiary education stuff, there is a lot of jobs. That means that there is an imperative for the government to try and fulfill these economic demands and ensure that people are not poor. That's why we say the government has an obligation to stop things like poverty and to ensure these jobs. Why is this better under our side, and why does Australia get better? Firstly, people fulfill that economic demand, and that means that we get more infrastructure under our side. We get more like cleaning stuff for COVID, and that means we have a safer environment for everyone. The impact is just the broad societal benefit in those regards. Secondly, the marginal propensity to consume increases. So that's to say poor people have to spend more money, and at the point where these people now have that money to spend, that money will likely go back straight into the economy, which equals greater economic stimulation, which is particularly important in a time of COVID. And lastly, we think that we just get way more bargaining power overall. That's far, far better. We emancipate the poorest people, and we do it comparatively better to side negative. We affirm.
Speaker, if a jobs guarantee was actually economically sound and sustainable, the government would already be doing this. Just to reiterate in their model, like it's anyone can take these jobs, they're fit or able-bodied, and they kind of invade like the learn to code meme by saying like we would reskill minors into certain industries. But what we're going to say is like our counter model that we propose is just our counter model is like essentially by stating our beliefs. So our beliefs are that one, welfare should be granted to anyone who needs it to live, because under Australia, we believe in the right to live and the pursuit of liberty and the eternal happiness. Second one is that unemployed people ought to be assisted, but we would see them to be assisted through like additional education and training. And we think it's unproductive to make these people work menial jobs at the expense of improving their own skill set. Third, that people are periodically unemployed. So not everyone is in a permanent status of unemployment. So people who are on unemployment, the benefits being used are mostly temporary. So like, why shouldn't an accountant work a median strip pulling out weeds all day instead of slinging interview CVs and practicing for interviews while earning a bit of money on the unemployment benefits? We value skills and reskilling workers. So we prefer the unemployed to go to uni and actually practice developing these skills instead of wasting their time. So through stating like these beliefs, we can show that why we would strongly oppose Affirmative's model of a jobs guarantee in the first place. We will show how a jobs guarantee will, one, harm welfare, two, is principally principally immoral. 3, will just create very bad jobs. So 1, why welfare is harm to begin with. So if you think about what a jobs guarantee is trying to do, it is trying to tackle the people who don't have a job. That's the whole point. So we are kind of comparing it to other existing models of unemployment, including the one that Australia has under the status quo. So what we're saying is, if we're introducing a new welfare model, this is naturally going to be at the expense of the existing welfare model. Otherwise, you wouldn't be proposing this in the first place. Second, governments have limited political capital. It would take a lot to get a motion like this passed to have such radical reform to the welfare system. If you spent your entire year campaigning on this and getting it passed, in the second year, if you needed to improve the welfare system, such as disability payments, you'd have a lot less capital to spend on that because you spent so much attention and focus just introducing a big, very overly simple welfare system. Third, this is likely to be more popular for bad leaders because it's under the guise of sort of punishing poor people. And we believe like this is always going to win out, like I guess in the majority of the population's mind over schemes like the NDIS. So we just see this as being like, it's actually going to frame welfare as being like less popular because like, I don't get it. These people have managed to get out and get a job. Why are these people who are sitting at home not get a job as well? So it's, the impact of this is like really who is harmed. Firstly, it is actually does bias the people who cannot work, the ones with like sort of unable bodies. The big reasons why this harms these people is this one. One, the determination on who can already work and not work is already scummy. It's pretty hard. Like we do see like arbitrary decisions made on disability payments and stuff. So if you did get affected by one of these arbitrary decisions, you would then be forced to get any sort of income for a job you may not be able to do. Second point is like, because there's less political capital to provide some further support to the people who needed support in the first place, like the disabled people. It would be far easier for a government to say that this group who were previously defined as not able-bodied is now able-bodied under the new work guidelines proposed by some bullshit third-party institution than introducing new program or improvements to an existing program. Secondly, why this is just principally immoral, especially in the context of Australia. So the premise of this whole case is that the right to welfare is contingent on your ability that you should be working. And Australia, your right to exist is not tied to you immediately holding a job. Like, yes, money is important. We're not saying that money isn't important. We're saying that you can be an Australian citizen, fit in Australian society while being a bum. While also being temporarily unemployed. So the mechanisms to prove this is one, like just the right to live. So like what we see in Australia is like the right to live is like you've got the right to food, your right to shelter. These are inalienable rights. So we do have this context. So we do have this idea that we don't get to make up like what are the principal rights of the Australian citizen. Like the state cannot take these away or change these through messing with the new welfare system. Second mechanism is why we say this is an affront to human dignity. Because the premise of the humans now under the AF's case, the premise of humans' life value is tied to the value of the state because the state only values your life if you're in work because they're going like, okay, well, this new welfare system is saying like, okay, it was useless for you to sit in Centrelink and do nothing with your time anyway. Now you have to work like in Soviet Russia. Third one is why third mechanism, individuals do not consent to birth. The state incentivizes people to have babies, and because this helps to because states and the state economy is benefited from having a bigger population. So state is obligated to actually help you and provide for you. It's not you are provided you're not obligated to provide for the state when you didn't get to choose to be born in that country. So the impacts of this is like any policy that affects your ability to exist is therefore illegitimate under our principles and must therefore be opposed at all costs. So third, why these jobs would be really bad. So Affirmative's claim has this idea that like there's huge shortages of workers in certain industries and they might train them up to match these certain industries. Here's the thing, if that industry did have a huge shortage, then under the free market, people would already try and retrain and then join that industry in the first place. It's unclear why you'd need a jobs guarantee to make people get into a construction. Like, can't they see tradies driving like huge cars and be like, damn, maybe this is better than working retail or just not doing anything? So like in terms of the mechanisms, like one, these jobs would be very unproductive in the economic sense. If a job is more valuable, produces like significantly more value than the cost of it, these jobs could already exist under the free market. The point of a jobs guarantee is to create jobs which don't exist under the status quo. And so the jobs that would be created by this new affirmative plan is these jobs would not create any more value significantly than the cost itself, so they would all be unproductive. So this would have a natural drain on the government's resources and a drain on the economy. Second one is like these are very low-skilled jobs because the people who are unemployed, unemployed, particularly the ones who are permanently unemployed, tend to be quite low skilled in the first place. So this work itself would be extremely repetitive and therefore not very valuable. So imagine pulling out all the weeds on a median strip on a 40-degree day. That's what a lot of these jobs would look like. And because these jobs would also be repetitive in nature, so it wouldn't be providing any sort of real benefit, like long-lasting benefit to society. Third is like in these jobs, you'd be unfireable, unpromotable, and there's no fucking pay incentive. Like, why would you do a good job, make sure you pull out all the weeds on the median strip? If it's 40 degrees, you can't get fired. You just get another job. There's no way to go upwards in this degree of work, and there's no pay rise. The impacts of this is one, it's really unpleasant for the participants themselves because you're making them just do some borderline arbitrary job instead of them sitting at home collecting neat bucks. The second one is that it's the moral to the subject we'll just move on to the second impact. So the second impact, this is a very unproductive. Because they're unproductive, they're high cost. This is a high minimum wage with less value in return. It's unpopular with the employed because they're going like, hey, they're just doing some random job. And third is like, this could be massive exhaustion of political capital. Fourth, just quick impact mechanism I want to stick in is these jobs themselves. There's no reason though why they'll be like anything on less than like a very shitty casual contract with very little consideration to the worker's health and happiness. So forcing needs to become wage slaves is a stupid decision for the individual, the government, and the economy. So proud to oppose.
Framing really can't be overlooked in this debate. In the short term, there is a global depression because of COVID, where Australia's had its first recession in 28 years. The JobKeeper wage had an expiry date on it, and the government needed to roll out vaccines. By the way, that is one of the things that like menial labor could be. That is obviously a meaningful job they could take. But that means obviously the government needs an injection into the economy, which actually benefits infrastructure and building things to recover from the crisis. Welfare is literally losing money and then it's never getting re-put back into the economy. We tell you obviously giving someone a job is better in terms of that short-term impact, especially because of the fact that if you don't work a job, then in the long term, a company will not hire you because they do not believe you have these skills in future. Reskilling can only do so much. Your resume is how many years you've worked on a job. But then we give you the second piece of framing, which is that in the long term, automation will essentially undermine the Australian economy. And that is because like machines and computers will be able to take the jobs of other people, meaning the economy will become less productive and the government has to transition towards employing people in industries where they can be useful, because that means in the long term, there will actually be no one who is able to work, and therefore the economy as a whole will not be productive overall. They provide no response to that. Those are at least like a few reasons why we're already so far ahead in this debate. I'm going to look at three questions then. The first is whether people can consent and make this choice. We say if people can choose, we should entrust them to make this personal trade-off, because that means they will come up with the best practical outcomes for themselves. But like, firstly, it's deeply unclear why the alternatives were just as bad. And they never even challenged this because, for example, like poverty means you have a lot of psychological harms. Like literally not having a job means you feel like you're useless, you're not productive, you're not benefiting your family, which means to a large extent, like getting a job is a benefit for you, which we ought let them choose. But secondly, obviously the other choice is a similar level job, which is something which is totally comparable and therefore they're not being coerced into it. They say their point here is just a principle about why you have the human right to welfare, for example, but we can still get that on our side. Now you can just choose between whether you take welfare or whether you take a job. And there are obviously reasons some people do take jobs, because some people evaluate their personal legacy at the end of their life in terms of how productive they are, their career has been, how they contributed to society for future generations. Obviously, by providing them a way to productively contribute, that's a principal right they also have and we uniquely provide. On to the second question then about individuals, because we say if we can meaningfully improve their lives overall, we ought prioritize this. And our big claim is just that these jobs will be good because of government regulation, because of elections and scrutiny and electoral incentives, and because corporations are largely unregulated. I get three responses from first negative. The first is you can't actually get reskilling under our side, which is just strangely asserted at the top of the speech, and there is no mechanization to prove why it's true. Here are three responses. The first is, obviously it's much easier to do reskilling when that's integrated with the job itself. So for example, if you're getting someone to do construction, then it's much easier to teach someone to construct something while you're on the site and actually doing it. That's more effective. Second of all, it doesn't cost that much more money to like actually reskill someone. And also, this is the reason why if we get people these jobs because you're guaranteed a job and now there is a large public workforce, you can pick exemplary individuals from that workforce and you can say you can now teach others this job, which means we get actually a greater base for people who can reskill others, and the government is able to teach more people because now there are those people available. But third, obviously work is the best form of reskilling because it shows you can do something and you can tangibly show that you're like you can apply yourself to a job, which means, for example, if you want to work at another corporation in the future or get promoted because you want to work hard and get like a higher paying job, then the government like giving you that job, which allows you to demonstrate that to a corporation, is very beneficial. Obviously, practically is the best way of reskilling someone. Then they say like these jobs will be awful. That is unresponsive to all of the reasons that Aman gives you, in the sense that we tell you why governments are uniquely going to be pressured into award good jobs. But then they say you're just going to be pulling out weeds, which means you won't feel any value in your life. The obvious response is we tell you these will be things such as infrastructure, for example, building a hospital, rolling out COVID vaccines, improving public transport. These are things people obviously would feel valuable towards because it benefits everyone in society and it has such a clear and tangible impact. Note at the end of this, jobs, like even if we compare the best case of either sides, which is they get welfare and we get jobs and everyone is earning the same amount of money overall, I think we're still far ahead in this issue and in this debate because jobs are better for people for two reasons. The first is that there is a social stigma when you're on welfare, which means, for example, like rich people or just like your family members will look at you and believe that the fact that you cannot get a job, which means you will feel worthless, which means people will dislike you. But secondly, like productivity is something which people value. That's just how it's placed in capitalism, which means people want to be able to do something. People want to be able to provide by their own hand and by their own merits. That is something that we can uniquely provide. So even if you compare the best cases, we are ahead. Then onto the third question about the benefits for Australian society. Obviously, the context that I give you at the beginning of this speech should be heavily considered because that means even in the long term, we're far ahead in this debate, but also providing more welfare in the context of the COVID pandemic is surely going to be devastating. The massive benefits we provide are you can build infrastructure. And that did look things like the NBN, for example, or making more environmentally friendly transport, which would be better for the country in future, or rolling out vaccinations in a specific time. But then we also tell you to no response that there are unique economic benefits from building this infrastructure, but also from giving money to people, for example, who are in lower classes with a higher marginal propensity to consume or spend money because they can't save it. And that means that money injects straight back into the economy. What do they tell us? They make this strange claim that we can just do the same amount of welfare instead. There are two real big issues with that. The first is that obviously it's going to be far less money because now the government has less money overall because now the government is just giving money to people without the benefit of infrastructure or actually having things which build the economy alongside it. That was the analysis and the nuance and we give you, but also obviously you get much less political capital to be able to increase welfare. They couldn't just fear they could do that in that counter model. And that's because of the fact, so like for example, we've proved welfare will be less than the money you can earn, but also literally welfare will be less because it's less popular. And that's because like there is the belief that you're not trying or you're not actually productive when you go on welfare, and right-wing people like launch a tax on you because they believe that like welfare shouldn't be given out. They say obviously like the economy would fill these shortages anyway if they existed, but like companies do not fill things which provide social benefit because there's no benefit for them if people can get to work quicker or environments are better or the COVID vaccine is like, for example, rolled out quicker. That's why, for example, these jobs like which provide a social benefit to broader society are not currently filled, and that's why we can get them. Then they say this erodes political capital for welfare. I think that is uncomparative, and I think we get actually more political capital for four reasons. The first is that we empower the working class because now they have more money, but now they also hold power over the government because they can unionize and opt out of working these jobs to get welfare. And to the extent the government is now uniquely vulnerable because it requires these people to work to actually be able to produce the things it's doing or continue a construction project, then obviously they have to cater to these people's interests. Second, you now have more awareness for medial labor because now you have more people who actually work these jobs, and therefore the government interacts with them and realizes that people do live at a certain like lower level and therefore maybe they should increase welfare overall. Third, we uniquely pressure corporations because like they were uniquely resistant to government pressure, but now people would choose government jobs over corporation jobs if they're at the same minimum wage, which means corporations have to raise their minimum wage to be more appealing because governments will obviously give more ethical and like just better jobs that have better conditions. But fourth, we also uniquely rebuild unions, and that's because in the context of how they've currently, like corporations have backlash against unions and tried to cripple the overall support for them. Now we have more people, and like we have Labor governments, for example, who will encourage people to unionize within these government workers, which means unions can apply more pressure. But also, even if they believe that this would have an enormous effect on political capital, it was in the context of COVID. It was in the, and secondly, the key clarification at the end of this speech is we're not reducing welfare. We're just saying if you want to take the job, you can as well. And they provide no reason we can't do that except for a few sentences at the start of first negative. For those reasons, I think we're winning this debate by a large margin.
The entirety of Affirmative's case in this debate is premised on the idea that these jobs would be good, because if these jobs are not good, they're not valuable, they're not productive, then there was no point in this policy and they had to lose. We give you a series of reasons that explain structurally and mechanistically why the jobs had to be bad that got no response. The first and most devastating for them was just the fact that they could not square the characterization of there are currently shortages in places like construction with the need for the government to step in and create jobs in the first place, right? Because if there was a problem of unemployment and a problem of shortages, those two things would work each other out. Both of those things could not be true at the same time. And if it was for a lack of skills to fill the jobs in which there were shortages, that was a reason for the government to engage in reskilling programs, not a reason for the government to go into the provision of labor in those industries in the first place. Which means that the kinds of jobs that exist are not productive jobs, are not construction jobs, are not jobs that corporations will do and provide right now because they produce profit and value to society. There were jobs that were unproductive and did not produce value. But secondly, that made sense for the reason that Affirmative agrees these are low-skilled jobs, not recognizing that construction is, for example, a skilled job that people go to TAFE and train for example, and therefore it is probably not those kinds of jobs, right? It's things that are like backbreaking forms of labor, like, moving the bricks from one place to another, or digging ditches, or all the other kinds of things that the government makes people do or has made people do as part of like work for the dole type schemes in the past. These were not jobs that made people better. They were jobs that made people's lives miserable because it was repetitive, backbreaking, unproductive work that did nothing for them. And lastly, we explained to you that these are jobs from which you cannot be fired or promoted from. There is no incentive to do better or worse at these jobs, which means that they will be done incredibly badly. That had a number of devastating implications for this team. Firstly, all the reasons they give you to believe that these jobs are somehow going to make people's lives better do not eventuate. Because if Aman claims is a really popular policy at first Affirmative, that was a policy we could also just defend on its own and on negative. If it was necessary to integrate the work with, the job in the first place, like construction, that was something that already existed in the form of apprenticeships, which is why you already got paid to do those things right now. They could not identify a single example of a job that is productive but does not exist right now, because if it was productive, it would exist right now, which explains why the type of work that would be here would be work that was just there for the sake of making people's lives miserable in order to force them back into the economy, in order to deter people from being on welfare, in order to make people feel bad for things that were beyond their own control because they got fired and it was their fault that they were not employed for some reason. It was an evil policy and it ought not be supported. The last things they say here are like, maybe we could have people build hospitals or give out vaccines. Again, these are jobs that nurses, doctors, and skilled construction workers do. You don't just randomly pull people off the street and make them do those things. That is not how the economy works. What are the reasons they give you to believe that these jobs will be good? One, that there is media scrutiny that also exists on corporations, right? Secondly, they tell you the government has a good culture. That is laughable. And thirdly, they tell you that governments have less bureaucracy. Clearly never watched an episode of Yes, Minister. What does all of this mean? It means that this was not a policy that anyone would opt into if on their world, welfare would still exist. It was unclear why you would not just, for example, take a job that a corporation or some other employer was offering that would probably pay more than minimum wage, which construction jobs do, for example, in Australia, or why you would not just stay on welfare until you could find one of those suitable jobs, which meant that they achieved no benefit. But there were harms to this policy. And the first one was that they absolutely would gut welfare as a result of this policy, right? Because it plays right into the rhetoric of people on the right wing, They want people to not be able to just earn money for doing nothing. And now when the options are, we could pay people for sitting at home, or we could pay people to come out and do work, why would there be any political capital left to defend the existence of welfare? Like, people on the right will just be able to say, well, we don't need welfare programs anymore, right? Because we have these programs. What are the responses we get to this? They say poor people will have more money. Unclear why. These are minimum wage jobs that people are very unlikely to opt into the first place. They tell us people now have leverage because these jobs are important, and therefore people will need to, we can opt out of them and threaten the government, not if the jobs are unproductive, as we have just proven. Thirdly, they tell us corporations will need to compete with the government now, and that puts pressure on corporations. We explain to you these are unlikely to be jobs done by corporations, because if they were, then you would just work for the corporation directly, right? Why would the government be in that industry in the first place? No explanation as to that. But even if they wanted to compete with corporations, that was obviously just an inflationary measure because they bid wages up in industries somewhat arbitrarily, and that was not a good thing. Which means all the mechanisms we give you at will as to why this would gut welfare, the fact that it is a program that has an identical aim to that of welfare, the fact that the government has limited political capital and probably can't pay a bunch of people to do unproductive work and pay a bunch of people welfare. The fact that public pressure will be on them to cut welfare as a result of this, that the blocs that traditionally have defended welfare will be weakened as a result of this, all mean that welfare was far less likely to exist. And then we explain to you why cutting welfare was a really bad thing. Or even in the comparative, assuming their best characterization, why it was better for people to access welfare than to access this jobs program. Firstly, we point out that their program is a waste of money because it does unproductive work. And then we give you 4 reasons to believe that welfare is more economically productive in the long run for the economy. Firstly, when you get on welfare, you're likely to access a better job in the long term, because either you access training and educational resources that are often contingent on welfare in Australia at the moment, and therefore able to get a higher skilled job and pay more tax, or you're someone who is structurally unemployed or cyclically unemployed, like you're an accountant who happens to be out of work, but probably can find another accounting job if you wait a month or two. Rather than being forced into some like random construction job, you instead just wait a month or two and get another high-paying job, which means you produce more economic growth and more tax revenue. Secondly, this is a policy that generates stickiness in the economy, right? Because now, if you know that when you're fired, you don't just collect welfare for a month until you find a new job, you're sent to like the gulag to do backbreaking labor, obviously you'll be far more afraid to engage in career changes or switch jobs. It means more corporate bailouts because we're terrified of the idea of their company going bankrupt, like again into expensive bailouts. But fourthly, yet less innovation, right? Like why would someone engage in entrepreneurship or sent into a terrible job long run, generated far more economic growth than their program, and were reasons that you should support it. But even if you believe that on their side they can defend both the welfare program and this jobs guarantee program, this is a reason to believe that into the jobs program instead of the welfare program, right? Like their rhetoric will convince people they won't do the more economically productive thing and the thing that is better for them. And instead the economy will suffer, which means even in their best case scenario, they lose. But lastly, we explained to you that if this was the case that this gutted welfare, that was a principled harm that you ought to care about, right? Because in a country like Australia, where the resources exist such that everyone has the capacity to live with dignity, denying people access to those resources unless they worked was immoral. That people had a right to a basic standard of living and a basic standard of dignity, particularly at the point in time where they did not even consent to their own birth, where the state incentivized those policies and the state said that they ought to do those things. The state ought look after them. You ought not be enslaved to the state by a jobs guarantee program. We're incredibly proud to negate.
The problem that negative team's case is a premise that if the jobs you're going to get from a jobs guarantee were useful and economically productive, they were always going to be there. But this is a self-defeating premise because they tell us that there are jobs which are like, self-defeating premise because they recognize there's a shortage in many jobs because it is objectively quite awful and people do not want to do them. People do not want to do backbreaking work under most circumstances. People do not want to pick weeds under most circumstances. And as a result, at the point where there is a shortage of jobs, then presumably it means there is some work which can be socially productive. And look, pulling out weeds seems like the example they rely on, but that can be socially productive because it means natural grasses can grow in a way which isn't like competitive with weeds. It means that you can clean up your sidewalks so that it is a more attractive location to be. You can clean up rubbish off the sidewalks so that you can walk in a city and enjoy it more and people are in a more happier environment. Even just moving bricks from different places to another place is still useful and productive because maybe it means the light rail gets built in 1 year instead of 5 years. All of this were productive and the failure to have the imagination to recognize that is what loses the debate by a huge margin. The first question I'm going to ask this debate is what happens to welfare? So let's talk about the counter model side negative put up. They tell us that, well, we're going to give universal welfare and anyone who's unemployed can get it unconditionally. secondly, the first thing to establish is that they simply do not have the fiat or political capital to achieve this, because their model uses way more political capital than our model for a few reasons. The first thing is that a jobs guarantee is obviously way less unpopular compared to way less unpopular compared to welfare. Because first, you can no longer, the right and conservatives can no longer rely on the logic that, oh, the people who are on welfare are just like dull bludgers and lazy, and as a result, should not be getting any assistance from the government. The second thing here is that it obviously uses far more government expenditure for absolutely no return. On the outside, yes, we give you a job, but you're contributing to society and making a meaningful effort to help it. The third thing here is just that at the point where, when you're in like a recession or something, the kind of popular trend towards welfare obviously decreases substantially to the extent that it becomes so unpopular you're often at the whims of everyone else. And the third thing to be said here is also very easy to justify to the public, because firstly, you can just say these people are working and contributing to society, and as a result, is a policy which will largely be relatively okay. At the point where welfare is deeply, deeply unpopular, a jobs guarantee at least makes it seem like people are trying to get out of a situation, which therefore means the implication of this argument is either, firstly, like that counter model just goes out in the park, or secondly, the counter model they implement is going to be very, very low, and it won't be able to allocate as much money to a welfare program, which means they're unlikely to be able to have welfare to support everyone who is unemployed, and even if they do, everyone will get a very minimum amount of money. And then secondly, at the point where they're getting much lower amounts of money, it's very unlikely they get things like reskilling workers, having enough money to go to university or take, which is obviously incredibly expensive. Like that was an absurd claim that they could counter model that. So the second thing to note here is just that what is the comparative on the outside? They tell us the comparative on the outside. The comparative is like the jobs guarantee when you work a really bad job, or otherwise you rely on welfare and that will get you a job. And you rely on welfare until you can find a job. That was probably going to be wrong for a few reasons, because firstly, welfare was going to be insufficient. But secondly, at the point where often people need jobs in the immediacy, this was going to be particularly bad because welfare is unable to support you in a way which is particularly good, which therefore means in order to live a basic existence and to be able to sufficiently support yourself, you probably would opt in for a job which gave you minimum wage and you could at least get a decent amount of money, as opposed to relying on welfare, which amount fluctuates over time. So that was why it was not good. The next thing they kind of hear from them is that you had a principal right to welfare and it was inalienable. Firstly, that was contingent upon the premise that you get no welfare, or you get no welfare on the outside. But also, secondly, the right to welfare is only contingent upon your ability to actually support yourself and provide shelter, food, and water. At the point where the minimum wage job also does that, we think we satisfy that principal burden. Then I think the best claim they make in this debate is they tell you, well, look, welfare gets gutted on the outside because we lose any political capital to do so. This was patently wrong for a few reasons. The first thing is that we probably get less capital for unemployment benefits. So for example, if you're looking for work, you're unemployed at the moment and looking for work, we probably reduce the amount of welfare there. But I think that we actually increase the amount of welfare we can give to people generally for a few reasons. Because firstly, since people are actually working, you recognize that yes, they're working, they're contributing to society, but the lives they live is not very good and not enough for them to flourish and for them to be good. That is the same kind of logic that we still give welfare to people with disabilities that is outside of their control, and we think the state should provide for them. We provide welfare to students who aren't able to earn high-paying jobs because we recognize they also need it to afford things like rent, to afford things like food, and to afford things like water. And at the point where you're working, you generate far more political capital to increase welfare in general states of life as opposed to unemployment. I would think that was going to be largely a good thing, because it shows that the minimum wage is often insufficient to be able to achieve the outcomes of people to be happy, and as a result, it was going to be far more palatable for people, and we weren't going to guzzle welfare in a way which was like what they kind of characterized it out to be. So at the end of this, we tell you welfare stays safe. You probably actually get more welfare on the outside, and it wasn't enough for them to win this debate. The next kind of claim then, the next kind of question I'm going to ask then is, are these jobs bad? And the first thing to establish that even if these jobs are bad, we already established they're not going to be the best. They're probably going to be repetitive, and they're probably going to be not not the best in the world. But that isn't enough for us to lose this debate, because we tell you that first, at the point where they're not the best jobs in the world, at least you're getting money for it. So that is like a fine transaction. But secondly, you have to be comparative, right? We tell you that there are many alternatives for you to choose in the world, and at the point where you choose to opt into it, that was fine. Alternatives included like unemployment and having to rely on welfare. Alternatives include working a below minimum pay wage job, such as like servicing people at char time. Or third, working in a sweatshop, which is unregulated and for a corporation. Or fourth, getting higher pay and going into things like doing like experimental drug trials or conscripting into the military. All of those were alternatives, which meant that at the point where you did not like the alternatives, you could reasonably consent to taking on this bad job, and it meant that it was likely to be fine. So that was why at the point where we maximize choice and allow people to do so, people who take this job guarantee are ones who consensually do so, and we respect their decision to do that. I think the claim which they also say is just like, I think the benefit they failed to respond to is just that, look, even if the job is bad, it is useful for two reasons. Because firstly, you can develop new skills. You can put a line on your CV as you look for other jobs. The second thing is that this kind of jobs guarantee thing is not permanent. It means that once you can do the job, it might suck, but if you look for other jobs and you get a better option, you can always change directions there. The third thing he said here, you can also get like a referee. So for the government employee, just like, can you write me a reference? And that was particularly useful for those who did not have much experience in job force, and that was okay. I think the next thing they tell us then is they go, well, the free market would have created these jobs, so all you do is like the super useless stuff. The first thing here is I already responded to this in my introduction, but the second thing here is often some of these jobs, it's just the corporations do not fund buildings or infrastructure which often have social benefits. So for example, corporations do not create construction jobs when you're building a hospital. They do not create construction jobs when you're trying to convert school buildings into demountables. They do not do things like build roads. They do not do things like improving rural infrastructure. And that was something which uniquely had a shortage of people to do so. And it is under our side where we allow people to take on these jobs to improve these infrastructure programs. And maybe you can't do the super technical kind of willy-nilly like technical stuff, but you could still do manual labor and you could do things which are going to be productive and which is currently not being done on the outside of the house. So as a result, the impacts of this policy are quite simple. We basically solved unemployment. That was a huge benefit because it allowed people to be able to live a good life and allow people to be able to progress in society. When you compare this to their best world, which is just like, well, people on welfare, they still struggle, they're still unemployed. The process of reskilling takes a particularly long amount of time. And at the point where you need income now, at the point where you need food right now, it is only on the outside of the house where you can provide for it in a way which is going to be good. So, panel, could not be prouder to affirm.
Let's ask 3 questions in this debate and prove why affirmative fails to answer all 3 of them. The first thing to ask in this debate is actually, are there options? I note here that this is a direct response to everything they bring you about, being able to consent to this, because clearly if there is no other option in this particular debate, right, the only other option that is available to these people who would otherwise be on unemployment and welfare is clearly death. Since they do not get money through any other means, they must instead be forced to take on the one that is given to them by the government. The first thing to say here, right, is that obviously the idea that they can support both this and welfare is patently absurd, and Udai tells you why, right? Firstly, that it is redundant, and this in and of itself is perceived as something which dramatically shrinks the amount of social capital that is actually given to these people. But also secondly, the amount of social capital that is given to them is significantly decreased at the point at which they are perceived to be sharding away taxpayer dollars. And the very reason as to why that might be the case is surely for the reason that Kat concedes in her speech, which is that these jobs are just Keynesian make work that does nothing and offers no utility to anyone because the requirements are so low level and so demeaning that by necessity, they cannot do anything useful because otherwise, as we give you, the free market would have already filled in these niches, or otherwise, right, they would be filled by qualified professionals who are already trained at doing these things, not some fuckabout who instead of like actually tapping the needle, instead just injects an air bubble into you while he's giving you the Pfizer shot and you die of an embolism. Deeply unclear as to what kind of world the opposition wanted to talk about in this debate. Next thing to say is that, there is a lot of fiat cost associated with welfare. Well, as we have proven earlier, right, we do have a significant amount of fiat in this debate if you believe our analysis as to why this job is unlikely to be perceived as popular because it is entirely fucking useless. But also, right, surely all of their second affirmatives speech, right, and all that introduction and all that rhetoric about automation and COVID is surely just a reason to believe why it is increasingly important to the majority of individuals that welfare is, made stronger, that welfare is made stronger and more appealing to people because of the fact that it is now just more than ever present in more people's lives. People who thought they had a job and were secure in that fact now no longer actually feel as if that is the case. They want the government to be able to insulate them during these times of crisis. They've become more aware that, yeah, actually, unemployment is not our fault. And so therefore, we should have welfare in order to insulate me. Even if that is selfish, even if that is not based on the principles that we give you throughout our speech, that is still a reason to believe why welfare is actually quite significantly more popular than it was, more so than any other point in human history, and therefore a reason to believe that even if the opposition's policy is popular, so is ours, because now more than ever, everyone needs welfare. The final thing to say here, right, is just like the idea is that at worst, under the status quo, you can still take the bad jobs of which there are apparently a multitude in the status quo, right? That is the entire point of the affirmatives model, which is to suggest then that you can have both welfare and also the ability to just take on these jobs, because if they are so low leveled already, if they are like accepting all comers, because if they are paying such ridiculous rates, then you would be fully free to pursue these bad jobs and therefore continue earning a wage, which if you buy their analysis about how jobs are so important, surely you believe that it remains important under the status quo. And then surely also you believe that they can pursue this under the status quo without the affirmative needing to step in and implement wage slavery. The second thing to ask then is this option good? Because even if this is a choice, we can prove then that it is either A, so incredibly unappealing and terrible for people that they would never choose it. And so it is redundant with welfare, and therefore we win the debate because the affirmative team has just nothing exclusive to their name in this case. Or secondly, they have to be tricked into doing this. They have to be misled about their best interests, and therefore that is a massive harm that the affirmative needs to contend with in this debate, and therefore one that sets them behind even more dramatically than they already are. We give you a series of reasons for the atrociousness of these jobs. Firstly, as I flagged earlier, that there is a free market incentive to fill in the gap. Second of all, that reliability greatly outweighs the other factors like pay if people do love jobs unconditionally so much. Additionally, right, low-skilled jobs necessarily require that everyone is capable of doing them, meaning that there is very little feeling of like having accomplished anything significant, because by and large, you need a significant degree of training to even do things which are regarded by the opposition as menial in this debate. Things like constructing houses to the point where they did not collapse and kill individuals inside is such a massively, difficult field that when it has happened, right, it is because of instances like this. It is because people did not respect the amount of time and training that went into these particular disciplines. And it is therefore exactly this kind of thing which causes massive public safety accidents, which causes the failure of infrastructure, which causes people who are already disadvantaged and relying on these services to become even further crippled in this particular world, right? They have a couple of responses to this. The first idea is one of culture. And this conception is clearly just based on white-collar bureaucratic levels of government as opposed to the realities which currently exist, in which the government is immensely demeaning towards people who are perceived as having no skill, as the affirmative clearly thinks they do. And because of the fact that the government is always going to look down upon people who have to turn to it because of inherent things like classism. This indicates the culture is likely to be one which is kind of terrible. You're going to have a lot of misfits, many of whom are in unemployment for relatively unrelated reasons and do not particularly share any sort of demographics whatsoever. These people are going to most likely clash. These people are going to be constantly demeaned. They're going to be working a soulless job from 9 to 9. This seems like a truly terrible environment for anyone to work in, and it is significantly worse than one on welfare. Because even if welfare was soul-sucking because you did not have a job, surely it was worse to have a job which actively demeaned you, which actively crushed you, which actively forced you into manual labor that exhausted you and prevented you from getting any other jobs, because your time was simply swallowed up by moving bricks around on the interstate at 40 degrees. Next thing to say here is that no work is better. And as I've already flagged, if people find that a meaning versus like money ratio too high for them to actually accept, the bad jobs that exist under the status quo, surely that is a reason for the government to then implement things like minimum wage policy, which would then make these sorts of things more appealing, or perhaps they should advertise their state jobs better, something which the government should probably be keen on doing anyway, because it just means that they have more like skilled hands able to fill the jobs that they so dearly need for things like infrastructure, all the things that Affirmative wants to talk about in this debate. Final thing to say is the idea that welfare is bad to sustain, and this just does not acknowledge like basic economic theory. Things like the velocity of money in which people who are on welfare are likely to spend it to do things like upskill, are likely to spend it on things like food even, as opposed to hoarding it the way that people in financially secure situations do. Second thing to say here is that there are long-term economic benefits like being able to take risks with businesses, which mean that you are able to have significantly more innovation and significantly more well-developed long-term industries, especially when all the old reliables like, manual labor, like manufacturing have been automated out entirely. And finally, right, Finally, if the idea is that the government is so strapped for these contractors that they just are not capable of at all constructing these things, then surely that is an excuse to hire more contractors in order to be able to do this, as opposed to turning to low-skilled jobs and hoping and praying that you can bootstrap an accountant who has never touched a brick in his life because he thinks the pause will give him cooties. And instead, we could just hire the people who already exist, who are already unemployed, and who therefore need jobs. Final thing to address in the last 50 seconds or so is this principle. And if you believe that, as the affirmative have conceded time and time again in this debate, that unemployment is out of someone's control, you should then deal with unemployment itself, the state, being bad, because that can happen to anyone. That can happen for a variety of reasons, some of which are totally knock these people out of any sort of employment at all, such as being disabled, something which the affirmative team just cannot lay claim to in this debate. And therefore, you should make everyone's living situations high quality enough that they just do not depend on having to work to live. At the end of that, not only were there no options if you believe the affirmative's own analysis, but the options that they did give were demeaning, unlikely to actually be spiritually fulfilling in the way that they so desperately cling to, and also it would just lead to so much unrelated outcry and furor that it was much better to simply implement better welfare policies, something that Australia not only wanted the most during this time of crisis, but also needed the most during this time of crisis. And there was no need for the government to implement pointless make-work wage slavery in order to get these benefits.